Hey, y'all. As a growing family, my husband and I love game night, especially when it's Wayfair edition.
Let's do it. You gotta name as many Wayfair furniture and decor categories as you can. Ready? Go.
Sofas, bar stools, beds, ottomans, outdoor seating, bookshelves, kitchen tables, garden sheds, mid-century modern lamps.
Time. Nice. You got 9 out of a lot. Not too bad. Keep practicing by visiting wayfair.com, where you can shop every style for every home.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
This is episode 322 of That Shakespeare Life. That Shakespeare Life is made possible by listeners just like you who sign up to be our patrons. Join us today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Henry Hansen, PhD. I'm a soccer scientist, and I have researched the mechanics of the 16th century football found at Stirling Castle. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
And it actually has an entry about a crystal button. It's item 112. It reads, "Item broken from Her Majesty, one button of crystal or glass," and apparently she lost it on the 12th of April in 1570.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
Shakespeare talks about unbuttoning your sleeve in As You Like It. King Lear undoes a button in Act 5 of that play, and Moth talks about making a buttonhole lower in Love's Labour's Lost. We've talked about clothes here on the show previously, but what about the buttons that hold things like sleeves together and various buttonholes? What were buttons like for Shakespeare's lifetime? Who was making them and what material was used? How are 16th century buttons different from the ones we have today? And would we find buttons in the expected places, or were there unusual ways to use buttons in Shakespeare's lifetime? To find out the answers to these questions, we're talking with the Renaissance Tailor, who specializes in creating 16th and 17th century historical clothing, Tammie Dupuis. Tammie Dupuis is a contemporary artist and educator living in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. When she is not in her art studio or teaching class, she's making clothing. She specializes in 16th century clothing construction, but ranges far and wide historically, from Anglo-Saxon to the 18th century. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Anthropology and Archaeology from Montana State University, a Bachelor of Arts in Fine Art from Cornish College of the Arts in Seattle, Washington, and a Master's in Fine Arts from Massachusetts College of Art and Design in Boston, Massachusetts. She is the owner, designer, and operator of the Renaissance Tailor website at renaissancetailor.com. Hello, Tammie. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm happy to be here.
Shakespeare writes about crystal buttons in Henry IV, Part 1, and in Comedy of Errors. He uses the expression, "one whose hard heart is buttoned up with steel." Now, of course, your heart being buttoned up with steel might be a metaphor, but it does make us wonder about what actual clothing buttons were made of for Shakespeare's lifetime. Were crystal, like we see in Henry IV, or steel from Comedy of Errors, are these actual materials that were used for making real buttons?
Actually, the first part of this, the crystal, there are actual instances of crystal buttons. I have a tiny little book that was written by Janet Arnold. It's called Lost from Her Majesty's Back. And it actually has an entry about a crystal button. It's item 112. It reads, "Item broken from Her Majesty, one button of crystal or glass," and apparently she lost it on the 12th of April in 1570. So there is historical evidence of crystal or glass buttons right there. And there's a couple of tantalizing pictures, and I believe it's Queen Elizabeth's Wardrobe Unlocked, which is also by Janet Arnold. But the steel was the first time I'd heard that, I'm ashamed to say, because if I were a better Shakespeare aficionado, it wouldn't have been the first time, right? But I went and hunted up a little bit of that because I was very curious about steel buttons or buttoning with steel. And I have this wonderful Spanish-English dictionary that's dated to 1599. So I went ahead and I looked in to see the word button, how it was used. And apparently there is also the use of the word button is used to talk about a pair of foils or rapier swords. And so thinking about that in the expression that Shakespeare used, I wonder if he is making an allusion to that buttoned up, the two foils fighting. I'm not an expert or anything, but that I found that very intriguing. So
I think that sounds very plausible. Absolutely. And every time I go through Shakespeare's plays, I find something I didn't know was there before. So it's just alive like that, which is fun. Now, how were buttons shaped and what was used to actually attach them to clothing? Were they sewn in or something else?
buttons came in a variety of shapes. If you look into the Museum of London dress accessories book, they talk about the three kinds of buttons that were made. There are the cast buttons, which are usually solid, and the shank is cast with the button. And then that button would be attached to the clothing, usually by linen thread because that's pretty strong. But there are also these composite buttons, basically two sheets that are stamped and then soldered together, and then the shank is put in later, also probably attached with linen. And then cloth buttons, which usually, not always, but usually were shanked with whatever you did to sew them together. So you'd stuff this little circle with wool or something like that, close it up, and then shank it to the clothing with that thread. So those are the three kinds of buttons, and they're all pretty well, they have an integral shank. And so they're all pretty well attached with strong thread, which at this point in time was linen. And so it almost didn't matter if it was a crystal button or a metal button or a cloth button. Usually linen was the way to go.
And for those of us who are not familiar with buttons and how they're made and attached, the word shanking it to the clothing, what are we talking about there?
When you look at a button, and these are all buttons, these are not buttons with holes in them. These are actual buttons that have like a button head and then a little loop on the back. That little loop on the back is the shank. And so that is what is used to run the thread through and then into the garment over and over and over again. Now, in cloth buttons, if you're using the thread that you made the button with, you'll go ahead and run that through and create a thread shank, which then you'll wrap. These buttons they're pretty sturdy. A lot of the historical clothing that I look at, most of the buttons are still there unless they've been clipped off. And they come in just a variety of shapes. Most of them are round, but there's some conical, some sugarloaf shape, which is a cone with a rounded top. And there are a couple that are domed but flat. But again, they don't have the holes through them as we would think of a button, the 4 or 2 holes. They're just this sort of bead with a little wire on the back that makes the shank up.
Now, was clothing the only place buttons were used, or were things like sacks or carrying objects or other items made from buttons as well?
I'm actually working on a bag that's dated to the 1500s that actually used buttons as an embellishment. So on each corner, there's a little button, and on the side and on the top are these little buttons that are basically used as an embellishment. Also, however, curiously, the word button can also be used to talk about the head of a tassel. So when you're researching, you have to be a little bit careful about that if you're researching and reading a historical source, they might use that word for a tassel. And it's not a button as we would think of it that goes through a buttonhole or a loop, but the top of a tassel. With anything historical, you have to kind of read through and evaluate it, right?
Now, Tammie recreates buttons from the 16th century, as she mentioned here with the bag that she's working on. But Tammie, what are the basic steps for creating a button from scratch? If we're remaking them today, what do we do?
One of the most used bases for the button was a shaped wood. So my favorite thing to do is go to whatever craft store I can find and get myself a bag of wooden buttons or wooden beads. So they have a hole in them, that I can put the thread through. I've worked with 6 millimeter, which is tiny, but it's also historically accurate, all the way up to 10 millimeter, which is a little more comfortable. And what I usually do is I get a length of silk or pearl cotton, depending on how I'm feeling about life. And I anchor it into that hole, and then I wrap through the hole and across the face of the bead, 6, 8, 10 times thereabouts. So I'm not wrapping the whole thing. I'm just wrapping what I call spines. And then after I'm done with the spines, I'll come back out and I'll start weaving through the spines. I'll do a basket weave, or I might go over one and under another, which creates kind of ribs on the surface. And I'll just cover the entire button that way. I'll also do button loop, or it's a needle method where you loop through the top row that you've just done. And it gives this really sort of nubbly appearance. It's very beautiful. It's also very historically accurate for the 16th century. So that's one of the ones that I really like to do. But you find all kinds of ways of dealing with the surface and this thread on the button surface historically. There's some that are just a plain tabby wove that was needle laced in. Some of them are embroidered, even jewels on the top. And so for me, I have to think about what it is that I'm making. If I'm making a very high class dress, I'm going to go with silk. I'm going to do fancy stuff. But if I'm doing something that's middle class, I'm probably going to stick with the cloth button and do it that way.
So who was it that would have been making these buttons for the 16th century, or making those determinations about, are we going to do this kind of weave? Are we going to add jewels? And was it the same person who was making the clothes, or was there a separate guild for button makers specifically?
Oh, definitely a separate guild. You could get into trouble if you didn't stay in your lane. There's actually court cases, I believe in Scottish court cases, where tailors have sued seamstresses for daring to make clothing. So tailors made clothing, button makers made buttons. In this point, they're actually part of the needle guild, the needle lace guild, the lace guild. So you see a lot of needle lace techniques on the surfaces of these buttons. I believe it's in Hungary. In order to become a master lace maker, you had to make a set of buttons as your masterwork. So it's very much embedded in the needle lace guild. But, I mean, that probably all falls down the lower class you get, so that if you are just somebody out in the middle of nowhere making your own clothes, you're going to make your own buttons. You're not going to be able to afford to pay somebody for that. Or if tinkers are, traveling the land, they might have sets of buttons that you can buy. But at that point, it's becoming, a cottage industry at that level. Higher up, yeah, no, just needle lace, just button makers, nobody else.
Now, you just alluded to the fact that everything in society for 16th century England was divided up by class, and I assume this includes buttons. But how were buttons divided up by class? Would someone in the lower class have a different style than an aristocrat, or even the queen, for example? Tell us about the range of buttons that we would see.
The styles and the shapes are probably similar. I mean, a button is a button is a button, right? But it's the materials that really indicate the person's class. In simple cloth buttons, the material which didn't cost a lot and which one didn't need a real great deal of experience or expertise to make, versus crystal or glass buttons that Queen Elizabeth I used. Those are real indicators of class right there. Cast buttons were made of bronze or gold and set with gems. So if you could afford that, that indicated your class. What a person could afford is a good indicator of their class, almost no matter what in this time period. And mentions of buttons are actually found in sumptuary laws. So we know they became an indicator of class and became regulated. You could only have so many for your class, whatever that might be. So they were definitely indicator of class.
Now, I know we would love to explore more about buttons and their history and how they were made, and of course, some of the beautiful ones that were worn by people like Elizabeth I. What are some of your favorite books or resources you can recommend for us if we're new to this topic and we want to explore it further? Where should we begin?
So I would begin with Janet Arnold's Patterns of Fashion. And I want to note that you asked me to come up with just 3 sources, and that was pretty torturous. I have a lot more sources, but these are my top 3. Janet Arnold's Patterns of Fashion, she actually diagrams the existent button in its actual size. And some of these things are so tiny, but she talks about how they were made, what they were made of, what the core was. Most of them are wood with silk over the top, but there's a couple of cast pewter buttons that are pretty smexy. The Patterns of Fashion, the cut and construction of clothes for men and women, circa 1560 to 1620. That would be my first book. The second book that I would definitely recommend, it has an entire chapter on buttons, but it's a little earlier, is the Museum of London Dress Accessories, Medieval Finds from Excavations in London, and the Museum of London Textiles and Clothing book, 1150 to 1450. They have a huge amount of pieces they talk about, and they very scientifically put them into various categories, talk about how they were made and what they were made, and a little bit about who would have made them. And then the last book that I would recommend, even though it doesn't do the exact kind of button that we're talking about, but it has some needle lace construction techniques that are really useful for adapting to a round button. And that is the 50 Heirloom Buttons to Make by Nancy Naring. When I was first starting to research buttons and how to make them, this book was a lifesaver because I could look at the round buttons, but I couldn't figure out how to start or how to really think about covering the round surface. And so this book, even though it's a little bit past this time period, was really helpful in just the construction methodology.
Thank you so much for these. These are excellent resources. And because we know there are tons more to mention that would be worth mentioning, and that Tammie herself is a great resource for information on historical clothing, we will place links to Tammie's website in the show notes for today's episode, where you can explore all of her resources and information on the history of clothing, including her article on buttons specifically, all packed into the show notes for today's episode. So make sure you stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Tammie, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
This was also a very difficult question.
This is the fun question. Yes.
Because I have a huge library. But being a contemporary artist, I would want a really big sketchbook. As long as I had fire, I could make charcoal. So just a really, really big sketchbook, I think, would be the one book that I would take with me, because, that would allow me to write things, draw things, make maps. I'm assuming it's a deserted island for a reason. So, yeah. So, that's my answer. A big, big sketchbook.
I think you would be very well set up there with that. And I don't think anyone's ever selected something creative. And I love that idea that you would have this, you could make what you would need for entertainment as well as education and all kinds of things. So I like that choice for sure. What's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Currently, if we're talking about clothing construction and research, I've stepped back in time a little bit to the Anglo-Saxon time period, right around the end of the migration period, circa 600 to 800. I'm fascinated with the way that clothing was constructed in this time period, because it's very different than Elizabethan stuff. I mean, Elizabethan stuff is very engineered and structured to shape the body. Whereas back in this time period, it's the body that shaped the clothes. And so the clothes are very rectangular and they're cut differently and they're not cut tight. But there's a bunch of embellishment techniques that are very interesting to me. I'm sort of looking at that right now when I'm thinking about doing historical clothing. Otherwise, I'm happy to be engaged with my contemporary art practice. I'm doing a number of shows right now as a contemporary artist. Yeah, that's kind of what's next for me, is thinking about Anglo-Saxon clothing and then just being an artist.
That's exciting. What a great comparison with Elizabethan clothing versus Anglo-Saxon, and the period clothes shaping the body versus the body shaping the clothes. I really appreciate that comparison. And we'll look forward to all the fun things coming from Tammie Dupuis. And we thank you so much for being here this week to take us through the history of buttons for Shakespeare's lifetime and what we can know about them and learn about them and just appreciate them that much more from the life of William Shakespeare. Thank you so much for being here to share this history with us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
As I mentioned, all of the links to the resources that Tammie recommends for you today, including the books by Janet Arnold and some of the other places you can look up some of the details about buttons from Shakespeare's lifetime, are available in the show notes for today's episode. You can find these things at CassidyCash.com/episode 322. That's CassidyCash.com/EP322. While you're on our show notes page, if you would like a more in-depth look at the history we're talking about today, including some images of these buttons, some primary sources that share information, links to Queen Elizabeth's wardrobe, and some of the details that we used in our conversation today, then you want to expand the detailed show notes that are available for patrons. On our regular show notes page, there's a button that says Become a Patron. You can use that button to join us as a patron or to log in using your Patreon credentials, and these detailed show notes will expand right there on the page for today's episode and all of our episodes on That Shakespeare Life. Again, you can find these things at CassidyCash.com/episode 322. That's CassidyCash.com/EP322. In addition to detailed show notes, patrons of That Shakespeare Life get unlimited access to over 150 bonus episodes of our show, along with special insider extras, including a video library, animated versions of Shakespeare's plays, and a collection of educator resources like hands-on history activity kits that help you take our podcast right into your classroom with games, recipes, and crafts that coordinate not only with Shakespeare's life, but with his plays. So they're great companions for your study of Shakespeare's works. Find out more and explore all the extras when you sign up today at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That's patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.